Hi, I'm Jacob Heilbrunn, the editor of the National Interest magazine, and it is my distinct pleasure today to host a webinar on the future of American democracy. We have a distinguished panel today: Graham Allison, Joe Nye, and Michael Lind. We will start today with Michael Lind, who is in his new book, The New Class War: Saving Democracy from the Managerial Elite, states that, quote, "The greatest threat to Western democracy is the gradual decay of North America and Europe under well-educated, well-mannered, and well-funded centrist neoliberal politicians." Michael, I'd like you to begin the discussion. Each speaker will speak for about 5 minutes. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Jacob. And thank you for having me here today. I think there are grave crises affecting U.S. democracy and democracy also, particularly in Western Europe. But I think you have to evaluate the health of democracy by three measures. One is the formal mechanisms of constitutional democracy. And I'm pleased to suggest that the mechanics of our democracy are working. That is Donald Trump's attempt, variously by litigation, by mob violence, and by the media to reverse the election, has been defeated. Had little chance to begin with. He has been impeached a second time. There will be an orderly transition of power to the new president. And we have had free and fair elections, for all kinds of offices in the US. So the purely formal mechanism of democracy, I think, is working. But there are two other dimensions. One is legitimacy, and the other is state capacity. And clearly, we would not have had Donald Trump as president, even as a president with a minority of the vote, had there not been real legitimacy problems. I would suggest that the rise of the kind of populism on the right represented by Donald Trump, but also seen throughout Western Europe and even Eastern Europe, this is a transatlantic phenomenon, shows that there are a great number of voters who used to be incorporated into Western political systems, often on the left. If you look at Europe, if you look at the Midwest, many of these were formerly unionized working class voters who used to be part of parties of the center left, and now they're backing center right-wing populist movements. At the same time, we shouldn't forget Bernie Sanders. That was a massive insurrection by a substantial part of the center-left electorate. So I think there is a legitimacy crisis where you have a kind of relic of the 1990s-2000s consensus, which I call neoliberalism. That's the usual term, which was shared by Clinton Democrats and Bush Republicans. And it's being challenged by a socialist left and by a populist right. And the third element of democratic health is state capacity, and that's the least discussed. But I think it is possibly the most important in the long run. And certainly if you're talking about American leadership in the world, because developing countries outside of the West, they're looking for models of effective government. And if authoritarian regimes seem to be more effective than liberal democratic regimes, then that will undercut the appeal of the model. And frankly, I think there is a crisis of effectiveness. We're fighting half a dozen apparently endless wars around the world. We cannot prevail. The foreign policy establishment tells us we cannot leave ever under any foreseeable circumstances. Where the rollout of the vaccine and the lockdowns has been chaotic. And frankly, I don't think it would have been that much different under President Hillary Clinton, because I think these are problems at the state and local level. The capacity problem is not solely the fault of the federal government, which for the most part mails checks, apart from defending the country. That's what the federal government does, mails Social Security and Medicare checks. So there's a deep rot in the administrative state, in our bureaucratic institutions, from the city and the county and all the way to the state and the federal government. So I think we can be moderately optimistic about formal democracy defined as free voting and free elections and even checks and balances. But I would be very concerned about the legitimacy crisis and also the perhaps the greatest crisis, which is that of American state capacity.
Michael, thank you for that introduction. We'll now turn to Joe Nye, who has long been an exponent of soft power, American soft power. And I asked him to write a piece last week, which he did, explaining why soft power may still have a future, and it was cited in the New York Times, I'm pleased to say. And so we'll now turn to Joe Nye.
Thank you very much, Jacob. I was going to look at two questions: what kind of a problem we have and can we recover from it? It probably helps to start with some historical perspective, which actually I put in the piece that I wrote for you. You go back to the 1960s, we've had problems with our democracy that are probably as great as the ones we have now. In a sense, if you remember the 60s, we had riots in cities in flames. We had assassinations of King and Kennedy. We had bombs going off in universities, National Guard troops shooting students at Kent State, and two failed presidencies, including a Nixon presidency, which almost led to impeachment, except they resigned. So in a sense, we've been here before. And one of the things we want to ask ourselves is what's new and what's a net assessment of where we are. In terms of where we are, I think if you ask the state of the democracy, I agree with Michael, you want to distinguish the institutions and the underlying norms. In terms of institutions, what I found most remarkable in the last few months is how well the Madisonian design has worked. If you look at the courts, the Congress, the First Amendment and the freedom of the press and so forth, that stood up pretty well. If you look at federalism, if you look at the evolution of power to states, there the fact that local officials and state officials were able to conduct an election with a record turnout under some of the worst conditions, the pandemic, for holding an election, is again pretty remarkable. And it produced some local heroes, like people like Raffensperger in Georgia and some of the Michigan legislators and so forth, who refused to be cowed by effective bullying by the president. So I think when you switch at the institutions level, I think we're doing better than expected. The norms level, I think it's a mixed bag. I think at the elite level, while there was a great deal of cowardice by some senators and like Hawley and Cruz and so forth, basically, when you come to the push comes shove, people like Pence and McConnell or Liz Cheney, to cite three notable Republicans, really stood up for the constitutional norms. I think Trump did erode a number of norms at the elite level, but some of them may be reparable, some not. I think the bigger problem is norms at the public level. Here, I echo some of what Michael said. Basically, the big problem we have is a polarization public attitudes. And some of that's new and some of it's not. Let's not forget that about a quarter of the American public lives in a pre-scientific world. By that, I mean that the views that are espoused by scientists don't matter. If you don't believe them, go back to the Scopes trials. There's been a large part of the public for a very long time which doesn't believe in that science is a dominating way of explaining the world. The other big change, I think, in public attitudes really is part of this realignment that we've seen, the realignment of the South, which goes back to our basic racial problems in the country. Remember when Lyndon Johnson signed the the Voting Rights Act in 1965, he said, "There goes the South." And it took several decades for that to work its way through. But you see it in terms of the realignment of the Republican Party and the racial division that goes along with it. So the interesting question to me is, there are two problems. One is that we face now in the democracy. One is, how do we deal with this polarization of attitudes and norms at the mass level? And the other is, how do we deal with the new accelerating factor, which is social media? Whatever the problems we had in the 60s, we didn't have Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And one of the interesting things about the current situation is the business models of these social media are based on algorithms which profit comes from rewarding extremism. You get more attention by having a more extreme reaction, and that drives you down a variety of rabbit holes. So the questions of what do we do about Section 230 that Trump railed against, that was something where he had a point. We haven't thought our way through this yet. So I think I would focus in terms of what can we do about the situation. A, keep it in historical perspective. Yes, there are a lot of things that still work, but we have some real problems in terms of political polarization and in terms of the role of social media. And that's where I would focus.
Well, that sounds somewhat like keep calm and carry on with some. So we'll now turn to Graham for his perspective, both on the future of American democracy and perhaps what it represents for our ability to project it abroad, or has that become infeasible? Graham, please take it away.
So again, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm pleasure to be on the panel with Michael and Joe. There's a lot to agree with in what they've said, and some points to disagree. But let me start by taking my first bite here, just to try to answer your question. So, is American democracy imperiled? Answer: yes. Will Biden be able to restore or reunify the country, or are we destined for deeper divisions? The answer is yes. Okay. And third, what are the prospects for promoting democracy abroad? I would say dim. Our best hope is to try to demonstrate, if we can, that democracy can work in just one country. So in the swirl of events in the past week, if you're not somewhat dizzy or confused, I think you haven't been watching. And when Jacob asked me to participate in this, I said, Jacob, I haven't written on this topic because I can't even figure out what I think, because I know I disagree with myself. So I've been stirring and trying to reflect. I think we're still acquiring and processing information, even about what happened last week. So the degree of coordination or conspiracy in the assault on the Capitol and the threat to disrupt constitutional transfer of power, I think there are a lot of facts yet, unknown. Nonetheless, I'll try 6 quick points on the topics. First, I'd say to begin with the confession, this group is not the right one to ask this question of, because I'm afraid, as one of my Chinese friends said the other day about me, he said, Graham, you're hopelessly pro-American. And I think that for me, I agree that the proposition that American democracy will succeed and Biden will be successful in reuniting it is a matter of faith. I really do believe that God looks after drunks, little children, and the USA, and that's our best hope. So my suggestion, Jacob, would be the magazine should ask some serious foreign observers this question. That would be a very interesting exercise to see what a thoughtful German or Singaporese or Chinese thought about this. Second point, do the events of the last week show that American democracy is failing, or that alternatively the system is succeeding? So I agree with Michael and Joe very much this was a severe stress test, and the system worked. It bent, but it didn't break. I would say, if you look at the performance of the individuals within it, you're reminded first of the wisdom of the founding fathers in creating a government, not of a unified government, but of separated institutions, as it's said, sharing power and struggling among themselves to check each other. And I think that if I look at the military's performance, which would have been crucial, Milley and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, great. If I look at the courts and judges in considering claims about fraud in the election and looking at the evidence and coming to a judgment, great. If I look at the states and 50 state governments and their secretaries of state, like this young man or this fellow in Georgia, running an election in the midst of all this, fantastic, I would say. And if I look at actually in the Congress, I think that the if you didn't read Mitch McConnell's statement on January 6th, I would say read it carefully, very thoughtful, very thoughtful. And Pence's note to the members who met on the 6th, again, very thoughtful about his constitutional responsibilities. So the net of this is, I would say, that the system was subjected to a severe stress test, but it worked. And I thought my former colleague Fiona Hill had a good piece on this out last week, though I don't think it was in your magazine, but it was nonetheless a good read. Third point, is American democracy imperiled? And I would say yes, in very deep trouble. How deep and why? It's why American democracy has become so dysfunctional is a big question, and I think deserves a lot more attention and a lot more analysis. Biden, interestingly, has thought about this as much as anybody that I follow, and he appreciates Lincoln's great insight when Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." He repeats that often. That's a profound truth. And if you want to see how divided the country is, I think you need to look at the evidence, but the Axios polls that were out yesterday or today are very troubling. It's not just that half of Americans voted for Trump, if you think that that was an impossible idea, and that if 26,000 votes had changed, we would have had Trump reelected. But if you ask now, what percentage of Republicans think that the election was fraudulent and the results were contrary to the votes taken, or what percentage of the House Republicans yesterday voted to decertify, or on the 6th, voted to decertify the electoral reports from the various states, or what percentage, I mean, the one that shocked me most is what percentage of of Republicans think Trump's recent behavior is acceptable. So you look at I would say, if you haven't looked at the Axios polls, I would check it out today. The answer is very disturbing. So how deeply divided? Deeply. Fourth point, are the current challenges to American democracy worse than the nation has ever seen before? Joe offered us a good reminder. No, only for those that live in the United States of amnesia. So if you go back to Lincoln's 1858, when he said, we're in deep trouble, he was absolutely right. Now there followed the bloodiest war Americans have ever had. So that was a deep, deep hole, but the US survived. In 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office, this was, as Schlesinger called it, the end of the old order. And it was possible to be very pessimistic about what was going to happen. So I think actually John Meacham's lines about American nostalgia and narcissism basically captured this right. We've seen worse circumstances than this. That doesn't mean that having survived 2 or 3 near-death experiences, our survival is assured, but nonetheless, this is not the worst that we've seen. Fifth point, what is most of the discussion missing about all this? I like where Michael is trying to take it. I would say even beyond the dysfunctional, sclerotic state systems that we have, is the founding fathers' idea that this whole notion of successful governance, and especially successful self-governance, is, I would say, unnatural, is extraordinary, is audacious, is uncertain. So when Lincoln said, whether a nation so conceived can long endure, he didn't think that he was asking a rhetorical question. So the whole idea that self-government can work at all in a country is, I call it, think of it as an American experiment, audacious, hazardous, precarious, an uncertain venture. So I don't think the outcome is guaranteed, and I think it's tested in each, all the time. It's a so-called, quote, work in progress, one that fortunately in the recent period we've seen survive, but that doesn't guarantee its future survival. Finally, six, fortunately, I would say even providentially, the American president-elect has as deep an understanding of this challenge as anybody that I'm reading. And I think for those of you, if you missed his remarks November 6th, right after the AP called the election for him, he made just 5 minutes of remarks. It's a great a video worth looking at. And I think if you look at it, you can't help but be struck by how deeply he feels this problem. He's going to have an inauguration with the week that follows. And what's going to be the headline of it? Americans reunite, unify America. Here's what he said the night of after the press had declared him the winner. He said, "I pledge to be a president who seeks not to divide, but to unify. Let's give each other a chance. It's time to put away harsh rhetoric, to lower the temperature, to listen to each other, to see each other again. To make progress, we must stop treating our opponents as enemies. We're not enemies, we're Americans." And he goes on from there. So the question, I think, before the House is how to reunify. What can Biden hope to do that would reunify the country? And even what can folks like us try to do? I have some thoughts about that, but I've taken enough of my time. So thanks.
Thank you for those eloquent and cogent points, Graham. I am going to kick off the discussion with a question. And I should also remind our viewers that you can submit questions at the bottom of your screen, and I will endeavor to pose as many of them as possible. My first question to the panelists will center on something that Graham just alluded to in his remarks, which is that some 74 million Americans did indeed pull the lever for Donald J. Trump. They cannot be wished out of existence. And people are also noting that even if you remove Trump from the political stage, the sentiments that he voiced did meet with the assent of tens of millions of Americans. So I'd like to pose to all the panelists, and I want to start with Michael Lind, about where do we head with the Trump voters? And Michael has previously stated that there is an elite contempt for the ancestral traditions of white native and white immigrant subcultures. Where do we head under these circumstances, Michael?
Well, to begin with, 75 million people did not vote for Donald Trump as a person. They voted against the Democratic Party for the Republican Party. If Jeb Bush or Senator Cruz had been president, you would have had pretty much the same amount. Trump, 5-10% of the vote maybe above, which he got because he managed to win over substantial electorates, mostly white working class in the industrial states, but also in every election, 2016, 2018, 2020, more Latinos, more Asian Americans, and more African Americans, still a minority, but there has been a shift among non-white voters toward the Republican Party, away from the Democrats, who still get most of the non-white vote. And there has at the same time been a shift among rich white voters towards the Democratic Party. So I don't think we can say that this is simply a matter of white racism as a backlash against the civil rights revolution or something. If more and more Mexican Americans and other Hispanics and a rising minority of Black voters and Asian Americans are voting for the Republicans as a party. So then I think you have to ask, okay, if this is an anti-Democratic Party vote, not a pro-Trump vote, how is the Democratic Party different from the Democratic Party when it had an overwhelming majority in the New Deal era? Well, I looked at the statistics last night. The Democratic Party of today gets the majority of the educated, college-educated Americans and professionals. That was the Republican Party of 1950. Franklin Roosevelt was supported. He was opposed by most college-educated Americans, most business executives, and most professionals. He was supported strongly by the high school educated white working class. And interestingly, I even found the statistics by grade school voters. There were grade school voters in the 40s and 50s, K through 6. So let's be clear, the Democratic Party today is not the party of Franklin Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. If you look at its base, it is affluent, college-educated professionals and managers who were the Taft Republicans and Eisenhower Republicans, all the way up to the Nixon Republicans. The Democrats are basically the liberal Nelson Rockefeller Republicans of the 1960s, plus the new left on social issues, which is also something that repels a lot of voters, including traditional African Americans and Hispanics. For example, right now, it is a litmus test to belong to the Democratic Party to say there are no biological differences between men and women. This is all socially constructed. Well, that was not the line as recently as Barack Obama's two elections. Open borders. Historically, the Democratic Party was the more restrictionist on immigration, all the way up until the year 2000, because it represented the suspicion of organized labor. And it was actually big business and professionals who favored liberalized immigration. So let's just make it clear, this realignment is not simply that the rational people are in one party. And I say this as an independent. I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I have no reason to be affiliated with a party since I'm not running for office or want an appointment. But let's be clear. There's a realignment going on. The Republicans are increasingly becoming the working class party, and a multiracial working class party, even if they still get minorities of the non-white vote. And the Democrats now have, if you look at the recent elections, the overwhelming majority of the richest congressional districts in the US vote for the Democrats in Congress. So we're in a new period. And I think that cliches about how, the Republicans are just white nationalists, it just doesn't work when the Democrats are winning over more and more upper class white votes at the same time that they're hemorrhaging non-white working class votes.
Thank you, Michael. I would now like to ask Joe if you have any thoughts on this issue of white backlash, white nationalism. How much of a force is it really in American politics?
Well, I think you have to, your point about Trump voters can't be ignored is correct, but you have to disaggregate Trump voters. And there's a wide variety of people who voted in that 73 million. It's interesting, though, that in public opinion polls, Trump always focused on his base. And he basically never approached 50% in approval ratings. So unlike George W. Bush, for example, after he was a minority president in 2001, Bush moved to the center. Trump never did. And Trump, I mean, so in a sense, when we look at Trump voters, we want to take the difference between those people who are the hardcore, the 40%, and the others that I think are mobilized by the Republican Party, as Mike said. On the hardcore, I think it's going to be very difficult to get across to them some of the problems that Trump has created. For that tranche in the middle, you see a lot of them already beginning to have second thoughts. This is the area I think that's going to be important for Biden to work on, to see whether he can find common ground to bring some of those people together. I think the Republican Party is going to face an internal question of how much it's going to remain the party of Trump, where he was able to use his hardcore base as a club to threaten anybody with a primary and thereby cow the center of the party. He won't have as easy a time doing this if he's trying to do it from outside of the presidency. And then the question is whether Biden can woo that middle Republican ground by having a set of policies which are aimed at conciliation. I don't know the answer to that. If he does well on COVID, gets the economy going again, and is modest in his proposals, he may be able to do that.
Thank you, Joe. Graham, do you have any remarks on this
I think
volatile topic?
Yeah, Bill, again, I'd start by saying I'm confused and I'm trying to understand. I think Michael's point is certainly right, that most of these 74 million people voted against the Democrats, not for Trump. So I would say that's certainly right. In an election, you just choose between the two, and more often, more people hold their nose and vote for the alternative than with great enthusiasm for the candidate. I think secondly, Democrats haven't appreciated the extent to which where the Democratic progressive agenda was put to a vote in referenda, it was almost everywhere defeated. I mean, I keep surprising people with reminding them what happened to the referendum in California, which is one of the most woke political groups in the country, where they had a referendum on affirmative action for admission to university, affirmative action for hiring, affirmative action for contracts, and it was defeated decisively. If you look, as Michael said, at the outcome of the election, Trump, or the Republican Party, was quite successful in contesting and even overturning Democratic House seats in marginal, in border states, both in the Texas and in Hispanic populations, and in Florida. So I think there's something much deeper going on here, and I think the conversation among most of the, I mean, if we take Cambridge as a deep blue hole, most of that conversation is very much out of touch with the facts that we need to be looking hard at and examining and considering. And so I think that Biden, because he is inherently, he believes in unifying and reunifying. He believes that compromise can be principled, but is necessary. He believes in working across the aisle. So I think it's quite possible that he's going to manage some relationship with Mitch McConnell, and that he's going to manage a more centrist than most of the Democratic, or much of the noise in his Democratic Party would like, agenda. I think everybody can reunite about defeating coronavirus. Everybody can be enthusiastic about the recovery of the economy. I think most people will be very thrilled to see a more dignified presidency and a more orderly and normal presidency. Some of the press will start complaining about it being boring, and it certainly will be different than the excitement that they've been accustomed to and that they've been riding. But I would say that I'm reasonably optimistic.
Thank you, Graham. So we have a nifty question from Ishan Tharoor of the Washington Post, and he wants us to make an excursus back into the past and concedes that as imperfect as these historical analogies are, some analysts have discussed the 1923 Beer Hall Putsch, which actually took place on November 9th, a portentous date in German history, also the year the wall fell and the year that the World War I ended. He says the Beer Hall Putsch is being posed as a cautionary tale for what transpired after January 6th. The fact is, the point being that absent real accountability and delivering a lasting defeat to Trump and Trumpism, the threat facing American democracy will only grow. I will throw that first at Michael Lind.
Well, look, here's the problem. Most American intellectuals know German history from 1919 until 1939 better than they know American history. They watch too many PBS specials about the rise of the Third Reich. Interwar Germany has no more resemblance to the United States in the 21st century than the Byzantine Empire in the year 1400. I mean, this is just absurd. It's a childish game. Why don't we look back to our own history? We have had demagogues, American demagogues in the past. You don't need to point to Mussolini or Hitler, who, by the way, were backed by the bureaucracy, the police, the military, and the upper classes, who all oppose Trump in the US. Look at Huey Long. Look at Mayor Michael Curley, the Boston mayor and governor of Massachusetts, represented, he's Irish American populist, ended up in jail. Look at the Fergusons, James and his wife Miriam Ferguson, successive governors of Texas, also quite crooked, by the way, but they did some good things for the farmers. I think the real historical parallel is 1896, and I'll briefly explain why. The post-war, post-Civil War political system in the US was a great advance over the previous one, which had been dominated by the Southern planter class, but it left out three groups: African Americans, particularly in the South, who were just turned over to the mercy of the local oligarchs. But in the North, it left out the farmers and labor. And so between Reconstruction and the Gilded Age and the New Deal, essentially the Republican Party, which was the dominant party, just crushed strikes and treated unions as criminal conspiracies. And of course, William Jennings Bryan, who is much more like Donald Trump than Donald Trump is like Hitler, and his agrarian populist, that was a doomed, somewhat crackpot crusade as well. Ultimately, the US incorporated these two groups. The New Deal incorporated farmers through farm programs, and it legalized and encouraged trade unions instead of treating them as conspiracies against the state. So I think we're never going to get out of this doom loop until the elites of both parties, and particularly the centrist Republicans and the centrist Democrats, say, okay, well, these folks, they may have crazy theories about their predicament. For example, free silver was not the cure for what ailed farmers in 1896. It's a crackpot theory, but their symptoms are genuine. They are really suffering from problems. And unless we want a bunch of crackpot populists, constantly destabilizing the system, we insiders are going to have to reach out and help these folks and not demonize them. And when that happens, when not only the Trump followers, but the Bernie Sanders followers have a voice and agency and power and appropriate programs that address their legitimate needs in the government, that's the only way I see us getting out of this system, out of this doom loop.
Joe, let me sharpen the question just slightly. The beer hall putsch, of course, Hitler was young and inexperienced. It redounded to his benefit. He wrote his memoirs, Mein Kampf, in prison. He used his trial to profile himself across Germany and gain a lot of publicity. But the problem with the analogy to Hitler, of course, is that Trump has shown no desire to create an American empire abroad. He has flailed at home. So what is your take on this question about 1923?
Well, if Trump were as skillful as Hitler, we would really have to worry. Fortunately, he's a narcissist who puts himself first and doesn't have the broader political skills that Hitler had. The other thing is, remember, even with the beer hall putsch, that's 1923. Hitler isn't able to come to power until 1933. And even then, in the 1932 elections, he doesn't win a majority. Hindenburg has to put him there because they're in deep division in the country. I think if you want to use that analogy, you'd have to imagine that we failed to cope with COVID. We suffer a severe depression, not a recession, and we're back to a 1930 situation before the analogy makes much sense historically. And even then, I worry about some such analogies. I think, though, the point that Michael makes is right, that a lot will depend on the ability of Biden and the Democratic Party to take seriously the concerns of non-educated college whites. I've suggested to friends in a only semi-facetious way, Biden ought to take the experience that we had with COVID, that period when we banged pots and pans in favor of nurses and delivery workers, and say, we're now going to have a day celebrating the first line workers. We're going to do something to show that these people are heroes in our society and deserve status. There may be a variety of things like that Biden could do to try to get away from the extreme meritocratic problems that Michael has talked about. But we'll have to see how imaginative he is on this. Not just legislative movements in the Congress, but popular movements which try to overcome this.
So,
Graham, I wonder if you want to weigh in on this briefly.
Just briefly, I'd say we could have a great debate about the 23 push. I'm a big fan of what's called applied history. And let me just remind you of the Ernest May method, which is one of the key skills in applied history. It's easy to think of analogies in which you say, this is something like that. And just the fact that you find a little bit of echo, or as Mark Twain's good line, history doesn't repeat itself, but there's a bit of a rhyme, one thinks you have some form of illumination. Ernie said, be careful, be cautious. Analogies can be very instructive, but in every case, you should take a page and write a line down the middle of the page, and at the top of one column, put similar, and the top of the other column, put differences. And if you can't think of 3 bullet points on each, take an aspirin and consult a historian. So I would say that's good advice for all of us as we seize on analogies. And I don't find the 23 analogy very illuminating. I think the 1896 would be a good discussion and worth to go. And finally, on Joe's point, just briefly, I think watch the inauguration and the week that follows. I don't want to seem like I'm being a promoter here. I've just been astounded to watch the depth of feeling in Biden himself and the people immediately around him. The theme of this inauguration is going to be called America United. And for 5 days after the inauguration, there are going to be events to try to celebrate this reuniting, as Joe was suggesting. So I think he's at least identified the problem. It would be useful if folks like us could think of specific things that could be done that would actually advance that agenda. And when I've been talking to students and colleagues about this, I keep quoting Eleanor Roosevelt's good line. So she said, it's your obligation to, quote, engage a fellow citizen with whom you violently disagree. So I would say that should be a charge for each of us every week.
We have a related question from Chester Crocker at Georgetown University, and I just want to give it a little bit of context for our panelists, and we'll start again with Mike. At the moment, we're talking about 20,000 or more National Guard troops in Washington, D.C. They've now announced they're going to shut down the National Mall for the inauguration. There are dump trucks and cement mixers blocking off many streets downtown now. So downtown Washington has become, in essence, a fortress, an armed encampment. So Chester Crocker's question is, how serious is the threat to American democracy from violent extremists aligned with far-right nativism and religious and racial intolerance? If it's serious, what should be done about it? Michael?
Well, I think this is a massive, unnecessary overreaction to a particular violent riot, which only became violent because the security guards at the Capitol were overpowered. If there'd been, enough troops, security guards there, we wouldn't even be having this conversation. We'd be having a conversation about Trump trying to, pressure the Georgia Secretary of State to find votes. But this is a massive overreaction. It reminds me when Charles de Gaulle was president of France. He insisted of going around to restaurants and things like that. And people said, well, what if you're assassinated? You're indispensable. And he said, the cemetery is full of indispensable men. So I think that this is just wrong. It's sending the wrong signal, right? That what was by historic standards, if you look at some of the anti-war demonstrations, in the 1960s and so on, we didn't shut everything down, right? As Joe said, there were left-wing terrorist bombings, of the Capitol itself. We didn't shut everything down. So I think a lot of this is security theater, and I just think it shows a lack of confidence. With respect to the question, there is zero chance that a small group of marginal YouTube personalities, who are neo-Nazis or members of the Klan or QAnon conspiracy theorists, are going to seize power in the United States. Absolutely zero. They cannot take over a single police department in a small town in the U.S., much less the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the State Department, the FBI, the CIA. So this is a figment of the imagination, and unfortunately, Democrats are using this imaginary threat of fascism in the U.S., and it is imaginary. It's impossible, can't happen. In the same way that Republicans, use the imaginary threat of communism and socialism when trying to discredit their opponents. So my advice to our political class is, stop cowering, go out in public. If there's a riot, there's a riot, but go out, right? Show yourselves. And also, let's have a moratorium on Democrats comparing Republicans to Nazis and Republicans comparing Democrats to socialists and communists.
Joe, what's your take?
I agree with Michael. I think the chances of a right-wing takeover by force are close to zero. They can still do damage. There are some people, there was Tim McVeigh who killed 168 people in Oklahoma City. I think you might find that some of these extreme groups will create violence. I don't think a putsch or a takeover is in the range of things that can accomplish. And I think the reaction we're seeing now reminds me of that great Mark Twain point that the cat that sits on a hot stove once won't sit on a cold stove either.
So let me disagree slightly. I just because we're being too agreeable here. So I think that we are a violent country. We should recognize that. I think that most of the blue folks forget the fact that if we were actually to divide up, red state people have guns and know how to use guns. Blue state people mostly don't, okay? If you look at actually the number of sales of guns in the US last year, I looked at this recently, 21 million. So there are more guns in the US than there are people. And several people, including Joe, has several of them, and me, okay? But we're very unusual Harvard people in that regard. So if it should come to a fight, I would say the red team will win. That's number one. Number two, fortunately now we have a national military that has superior force. So I think a very sharp reminder that we do have a national military, which is subordinate to civilian authority, which understands its constitutional role. And again, I thought the Milley JCS letter this week was outstanding, that's a crucial fact. And it's worth everyone who would imagine that they could be violent successfully, knowing that they face overwhelming force against them. But then finally, third, disagreeing again slightly with Michael, no, of course it's easy for such groups to take over. You said a police station. I think they did that in Seattle for more than a month. So taking over a building, even governmental buildings, I think is quite possible for people to do. I think it should be, obviously it should be prevented, and anybody that did this should be properly prosecuted. So I think the thing that's been so disappointing, and this is back to Michael's state incapacity. I mean, if you look at these pictures of National Guardsmen and women sleeping around in the Capitol, oh my God, these will come back to haunt us the way the pictures of people leaving Vietnam when that collapsed. What in the world are they doing sleeping around in the halls? It is not hard to secure a building. Most buildings are secure most places against most threats, and they're not met by people inhabiting the building as opposed to protecting the perimeter. So I think that back to your question that you asked earlier about what does this mean for America as a beacon of democracy going forward? In all the rest of the world, the pictures from the past week, both of the storming of the Capitol and then of the incompetent protection of the Capitol, will come back to haunt us.
We have a question from General Chip Gregson, who notes that disinformation is suffusing the United States, fueled by sources, both foreign and domestic, and accelerated by social media, among other modern communication means. How do we stop it from continuing to damage our political dialogue and democracy? Michael, do you take this as a serious problem?
Well, yes and no. A couple of years ago, a poll showed that a majority of Democratic voters believed that Vladimir Putin had actually changed the votes in the voting machines so that Donald Trump won. So that shows you that irrationality is not limited to the right. And there's always been, crazy conspiracy theories and things like that. The other thing is, I am much less concerned about the effect of social media on our politics than a lot of people are, because according to Pew Charitable Trusts, only 22% of Americans are even on Twitter. Of that 22%, 20%, or about 4% of the population, emits 80% of all tweets. So if you look at where most Americans get their information, particularly working class Americans, Twitter, Facebook, social media, it's overwhelmingly college-educated Americans. We're mostly liberals and Democrats at this point. Working class, high school educated Americans, in fact, are the least likely people in the US to see a Russian meme on social media because they're unlikely to be on social media. They get their information from TV, cable TV, Fox News in particular, and from radio. So I would just push back against this idea. It's a problem. We have ISPs. Presumably, it is technically possible, if you're talking about foreign disinformation, just to block it. I have no problems with that. If Russia or China is like sending memes to the internet, just block it. I don't think that violates anybody's civil liberties. But again, my concern about this is there are really two theories. One theory is that political discontent expresses genuine material problems which need to be addressed at their roots by the political system. The other is that our system is basically fine, but 20 or 30 or 40% of the population has been brainwashed by social media or TV or Donald Trump or parties. And I just, I sound like a broken record. I think there are deep social problems. And if we got rid of all disinformation tomorrow, it might affect things at the margins, but these problems are going to manifest themselves in other ways.
Joe.
Well, here we can finally get some disagreement. At least I can find some with Michael. I've been spending a fair amount of time looking at cyber issues and particularly information questions. What's striking is the way these 20% on Twitter are able to set the agenda for cable television, which is Fox and so forth. And the net effect of this is through a transmission of belt of ideas, you wind up with a large portion of the population, or a large portion of the Republican Party, I should say, who believes that Trump beat Biden in the election. And the fact that there's 60 court cases which have looked at the evidence and said it's lacking hasn't changed their views, because it's constantly repeated through this mechanism. So I think Chip Gregson's point about the big lie is correct. What
about, sorry to interrupt, Joe, but what about the 60% of Democrats who believe what is obviously technically impossible, that Putin changed the 2016 election result? That's why too.
Yeah, no, I don't think this is just the right or the left. I mean, my point is that the algorithm which run Facebook, Google, YouTube, and so forth, rest on getting people to keep clicking, and they keep clicking by going further and further into extremes. This is something that's been studied and proven, and that can be left or right. I mean, it's not just right. I was happening to use the big lie about the election because it's recent and it's on top of our minds, but it works both left or right. And I think this is a question which really, it's not new that you have big lies in our democracy. What's new is that you have this accelerant. It's like throwing gasoline on a fire. And so social media has produced a technique or technology which basically is an accelerant for something that's always been around. And in that sense, I think it does raise new sets of problems for our democracy. And the fact that the Russians can use this as well is only a part of it. I think we did far more damage to ourselves in social media than the Russians did. But the fact is that the Russians learned that Facebook, even though it was an American company, could be used as a device against America. And they discovered, and this was a new form for our information campaign before we became aware of it. So I think this is why I suggested in my opening remarks that one of the things we should be looking at is how are we going to treat Section 230 of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act? How do we want the companies to have the power that Twitter's exercising now? Is there another way to deal with this? Should these be treated as editorial decisions rather than just simple pipes? We haven't really gotten our minds wrapped around this enough.
Graham, do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I would probably take us off even into a deeper morass here, but I think the degree of disinformation and views that are held by the American population that are nuts, both by folks on the right and on the left and many others, is deeply disturbing. I don't know whether it's much graver now than it was before, because it's hard to get good evidence about that. We've always had a substantial part of the population that have believed very extraordinary things that are not true, at least that we think are not true. I think this has been exacerbated by social media, but I agree with Michael, that's easily exaggerated given the question of whether the populations that aren't impacted by that, or what the relative importance of that on the one hand as compared to, say, the emergence of serious Fox and equivalent television outlets. And I think so I find it, this is another one of the areas where I'm confused. I think it would be worthwhile to have a group of people who'd have significant disagreements write down some of the things that they think are most about which people are most disinformed, and then try to see where we see those come from. And I think most of the effort to blame the Russians or Chinese or Iranians or someone else for this is escapism.
I want to circle back.
Jacob, can I make just one more brief point? So I think you have to look at the characteristics of the people that this falls on. So I agree with Joe. I think you can have, for junkies on the internet, this does have a dangerous radicalizing effect. I think if you look at somebody who belongs to a labor union, belongs to a church or synagogue or mosque, is married with kids, has property payments, there are other individuals in that person's life. So when they read that, like, the elders of Zion are in control, right? Or whatever, these people can say, oh, that's just nonsense, right? They're interacting with other people. I do think we have a crisis of what the French sociologist Emile Durkheim called anomie, normlessness, isolation in the US. And if you look at the people who showed up at the Capitol, who were part of the Antifa riots in the summer, I think you'll find a lot of alienated people who are very disconnected. Robert Putnam has said about this. So I just want to make it clear. I think that whether the gasoline creates a fire depends on how flammable the tinder is. And that's another thing we have to think about, like the people in our society who are receptive to this. Why are they receptive to it?
I want to circle back to one of the most fundamental questions that America is facing right now. And it relates to the second half of Ishan Tarur's question about the beer hall putsch. I think we got distracted a little by the putsch itself. The gravamen of his question was, is it a mistake to allow Trump to get off scot-free for inciting a riot? So are we actually doing the right thing in pursuing a second impeachment, or will it in fact embolden Trump and strengthen his hold on the GOP ultimately? Michael, can you start?
I have no idea. I am not a prophet about the political effect of this. We don't know the facts yet. We really don't. So was Trump colluding and coordinating with people in this crowd? Where was he working with other members of Congress and so on? I think it's a quite a different situation. If he just went out and made this inflammatory speech, and a few tweets, and then the thing blew up and he didn't foresee it. On the other hand, if this was a coordinated thing, that's a crime. But I think we're all in agreement here. If the system isn't broke, don't fix it. We have a perfectly functioning criminal justice system, which applies to former politicians and officers of state. We have the system of checks and balances. So I think we're only a few days after something, and I, for one, do not have the information and I don't know who does, that would allow us. We have something called trial by jury in the United States. Trump has to actually be accused of a crime before he can be punished. Impeachment is a political decision. But when you're talking about criminal law, you are innocent until proven guilty. And I will assume that Trump, like all of the US citizens, is innocent of a crime until he has been credibly charged, arrested, hailed before a judge, and then goes through trial by jury.
Joe?
I think it was right to impeach Trump a second time based on the evidence you have, which is that his behavior was unconstitutional. And note that they cited not just the riot, but also the call to Raffensperger of trying to force him to find additional votes to overcome an election. I think that is impeachable, and I'm glad that the House impeached him. However, where you go from now, I kind of like James Clyburn's idea that instead of going immediately to the Senate trial, where they might in fact just acquit him and Trump will feel justified or vindicated, and in the meantime, Biden's agenda is interfered with. Clyburn's suggestion that, well, maybe you should wait to get Biden's first 100 days under the belt and then see whether you need a trial in the Senate, that you may have gotten what you need from this through the impeachment.
Graham?
So I agree with Joe that Clyburn's advice, I thought, was wise advice to try to have a little calm and for more evidence to arrive. But I think that Michael is certainly right that there's a question of criminal guilt in this instance that should be tested by a criminal court process. And I think that given our First Amendment regime, from what I can understand of what Trump did on the basis of the evidence today, if he were charged with a crime of inciting insurrection or violence, I think he would be found innocent if that was a criminal charge. Thirdly, as Michael said rightly as well, this is not simply a criminal case. This is a political judgment. The Constitution calls on Congress to hold presidents accountable in the case of high crimes and misdemeanors, ill-defined or not defined. And so I was asked by a number of folks, what would I do if they had to vote on the impeachment this week? And I said, reluctantly, I would vote to impeach him. I would not have voted for impeachment the first time round. That's a different, so to be controversial, but this time I would, because I think on the basis of the evidence available, if a decision had to be made now, and I think given the risks that he would do something else between now and January 20, that the evidence suggests enough to me for political purposes that he sought to disrupt the orderly constitutional transfer of power. And I think actually that's what both Pence and McConnell concluded. And I think that's why we're going to see an orderly transfer of power.
Well, with the power vested in me as moderator, I am now going to bring this, to use Trumpian language, incredible and amazing discussion to an orderly conclusion. Thank you for watching, and we will be back with another webinar soon.
So thank you.
Thank you.